Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Start.
Welcome to today's webinar. Today's presentation is titled Reduction in Force, Local Government, School District, and New York State Public Authority Employees, CSEA Layoff Recall Training. My name is Nisha Stiller-Frankson, and I am with the CSEA Education and Training Department. I will be your host for today's session. Our presenter today is Don Kelly, Deputy Director of Contract Administration Research. Don has been employed with CSEA for over 39 years. He has been Deputy Director of Labor Relations Research Division since 1992. He received his bachelor's degree from the College of St. Rose in Albany. He is a member of the New York State AFL-CIO Public Employees Pension Task Force. He has been involved in civil service law and pension issues over his entire career. Don currently serves on the New York State Comptroller's Pension Advisory Council. He frequently reviews and or drafts state legislation seeking to improve the quality of work life for CSEA represented workers. He's also a graduate of the 2005 Harvard Trade Union Program at Harvard University. And with that, I will turn it over to your presenter today, Don Kelly.
Thank you, Nisha. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Thank you so much for tuning in to this webinar. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that's not a pleasant topic to talk about, but we must prepare for the worst and hope for the best. During times of economic downturn, governments often look to ways to reduce spending in order to make their budget balanced. Unfortunately, one of the chief ways that employers look to reduce their expenses is to reduce the workforce. We, as a union, work with the employer to suggest many different alternatives to reducing costs so the balance can go back to the budget. Reductions in force are the last resort. We work very hard to try to prevent these from happening. In the event that your employer does go through a layoff or a reduction in force, this presentation hopefully will be able to provide you with the answers to many of your questions that you've been pondering over the years. Please know that your human resources department are probably ill-prepared for layoffs. They don't know about the layoff process for the most part. They have to learn it as they go through it. So you will have a little bit of an advantage here because this information will be vital to you understanding the ins and outs of the layoff process. This presentation, as Nisha had indicated, is designed for local government employees, school district employees, and employees of authorities. The agenda today, we will look at statutory protections, which means what laws, rules, and regulations apply to public sector employees. We'll look at who has layoff rights and who doesn't. We'll talk a bit about layoff units. All layoffs happen within layoff units. You cannot bump or displace outside of the layoff unit. Seniority for layoff is different than perhaps seniority for other contract items. Seniority is very important. You need to know what your classified seniority date is for layoff purposes. We'll talk, once we learn about the definitions, we'll talk about the layoff process itself. The layoff process itself is rather simple and straightforward once you understand the terminology. Reinstatement, that's what happens after someone is laid off or they bump down to a lower salary level title. And how do we get them back to where they were prior to the layoff? That's reinstatement through preferred lists. And then finally, we'll provide you with a number of resources. But right away, I want to give you the website for CSEA so that you can look at those resources after the video and be able to download booklets and a layoff services guide. That website is www.CSEA'Ny.org. Please feel free to stop this video at any time during the presentation and rewind it if you are confused about an issue. So here we go. What members need to know? Layoff terminology. Layoff terms. There are many, many terms that may be foreign to folks who've never gone through a layoff process. There are some terms that are similar to terms we use every day. But through this presentation, hopefully you'll have a better understanding of the terms that we need to understand through the layoff process. Official classified civil service title. That is the title that civil service has determined is your title with the employer. Not necessarily the title you use every day. With all of the title consolidations that's been going on over the last several years, it's important that we all know what our current official classified civil service title is, as well as any of the titles that we've held in the past. We'll talk about jurisdictional classification. This is for classified service titles. Most titles that are represented by CSEA fall into the competitive class. Competitive class are those titles where one must be appointed off of an eligible list after taking a civil service examination. Within the classified service, we also have non-competitive class titles. Non-competitive class titles typically are those that do not require an examination to be appointed to. Now, the reason why this slide has part-time in parenthesis or Spanish speaking is my reminder to remind you that any title with a parenthesis after it is a separate title than the same title without the parenthesis. I'll give you an example. Typist part-time would probably be in the non-competitive class. The title of typist without the parenthesis would normally be in the competitive class. In the competitive class, we also have titles in the clerical field that have language designations like Spanish speaking or Chinese speaking or French speaking. If you see a parenthesis after a title, that title is different than the title without the parenthesis. That's important when we go through the layoff process because layoffs happen with exact titles, okay, whether they have a parenthesis or not. And the parenthesis designates a separate title. Hopefully, I'll clarify that as we go forward. The labor class, those are titles where they're typically unskilled labor. And exempt class, those are titles basically where an employee serves at the pleasure of the appointing authority. We do represent some exempt class titles. Those individuals in the exempt class do not have any layoff rights at all under law, rule, regulation, or contract. In the unclassified service, which is a separate large group of titles, we have titles like teaching assistant. Teaching assistant is a unclassified service title because it's considered to be instructional. The rights and benefits of being in the unclassified service fall under the education law for instructional titles. Like teachers or teaching assistants, one would have to look to the New York State education law to find out what the tenure requirements are, as well as layoff processes. Finally, appointment type. What kind of appointment do you have? Are you permanent? Are you temporary? Are you provisional? If you have any questions about any of these terms, please contact your Human Resources Office and/or Civil Service Administration office and ask, because it's better to have all this information accurate and you understand this information prior to any layoffs. Let's go right into some of the definitions that we will be using. It's important that you understand this because these are the terms that you will have to understand as we go through the layoff process. Layoff unit. What is a layoff unit? We get many questions about this. A layoff unit in local government is defined as a department. So if you're a county employee and you work for the health department, that is your layoff unit. Now, you may work in a division of the health department, but the layoffs, when they happen, encompass the entire layoff unit or the entire department. Your classified service title, just mentioned that. What is your civil service classified service title? That's the official title that will be used when we go through the layoff process. Jurisdictional classification. Is your title in the competitive class, the non-competitive class, the labor class, the exempt class, or the unclassified service? It's important because, and this is if you want to write down a note here, civil service law and your local civil service rules and regulations only apply to competitive class titles during a layoff process. The non-competitive labor exempt class employees, you would have to look to your collective bargaining agreement or your contract for layoff language. If you want to know what I mentioned, that the local civil service administration has this information. If you are a non-city employee working in a public sector position, you are covered typically by the rules and regulations of the County Civil Service Administration. That includes school districts. School district employees are covered by the Civil Service Administration that covers your employer. Now, city employees, many cities across the New York State have their own Civil Service Administration. If you're a city employee or a school district within that city, you would fall under the city's civil service rules and regulations. So if you're looking to find out, you want to get a copy of the local civil service rules and regulations, you would contact either the county civil service administration or the city civil service administration. There are only two towns, town of Hempstead and the town of Colony, that have their own civil service administration. Employees of those towns would go to the county civil service administration to request a copy of the rules and regulations. Many civil service administrations currently have the civil service rules and regulations and appendices online. If you can't find them online, then contact those administrations. I mentioned the appendices. The appendices list all the titles that are not in the competitive class. And I'll explain that in just a moment. Promotional line. What is your promotional line? Are you a principal level title? That means that there should be a senior level position below you, as well as an entry level position. A promotional line typically is a title series, promotional series, with the same generic root title, such as typist, senior typist, principal typist, or typist 1, which is the entry level, typist 2, which is the senior level, and then the principal typist, which is typist 3. So if your title series has a promotional line, you need to know what that promotional line is. And that'll come in very important as we discuss the vertical displacement. Appointment type. Are you permanent? Are you a temporary employee? Are you a provisional employee? What appointment type do you have on the date of layoff? That's the most important thing. Permanent employees in a position on the date of layoff have rights to that position. If you're serving temporary or provisionally at a higher level title, you are not permanent in that title. You may have a hold item in a lower level title. That is where your civil service rights are for layoff process and layoff purposes. Your classified seniority date. What is your date of seniority for layoff purposes? We have many, many definitions of seniority within the contract. Your definition of seniority for layoff, again for competitive class titles, is the date that you were very first hired on a permanent basis in the competitive class, or the classified service, I should say. You could be hired permanently in a labor position initially, and then through your years of service with the employer, advance to a competitive class title. On the date of layoff, if you're permanent in that position, all your permanent service, regardless of what jurisdictional classification, competitive, non-competitive labor, all that service counts towards your seniority. But what is very important is on the date of layoff, you must be in the competitive class in order to use all of that service credit. Your seniority date may be different than your retirement date, because your retirement date you can join if you're permanent or you're temporary or you're provisional. What matters is, what was your date of original permanent appointment? We'll explain that a little bit further as we go along. Veteran status. Are you a veteran? If you are, thank you so much for your service. Your benefit is extra service credit that is added to your classified seniority date. Methods of displacement. We're going to talk about horizontal displacement, vertical displacement, and retreat. Once a person is laid off or reduced in title, you still have rights for appointment back to where you came from. off of a preferred hiring list. Those lists last for 4 years from the date of layoff, if you're in the competitive class. Okay, we're going to use that terminology with a little bit more further explanation as we go forward. Who has layoff rights? Civil service law and the local rules and regulations only grant layoff rights to permanent competitive class employees in local government, school districts, authorities, and so on. I mentioned before about layoff units, and I mentioned in local government that they are by department. What I neglected to say, and I'll say it now, is that school districts are considered to be a single layoff unit, regardless of what internal department within the school district or location of the school. You work at a high school, a middle school, an elementary school, the main office, superintendent's office. Doesn't matter. You have one layoff unit. All bumping and retreating occur within the school district. Okay? So let's talk about, again, who has layoff rights? Competitive class employees. Section 80 of the Civil Service Law and your local rules and regulations define the layoff process, and it only applies to the competitive class. But what about non-competitive and labor class employees? If your contract has a provision for the layoff process, it will be in your contract or an employer past practice, but hopefully it's in your contract. If it's not in your contract, you need to talk to your unit president, and we can do impact bargaining and negotiate a layoff process that mirrors the competitive class. What is your appointment type? Are you permanent? If you're permanent and in the competitive class, you have the most rights. And then your seniority comes into play within your title. If you're non-permanent, you have no rights to the position where you currently are appointed. If a layoff happens and you are non-permanent, if you have a hold item, you can go back to your hold item. If you don't have a hold item, unfortunately, you're probably going to lose your job and be unemployed. And you have no statutory or legal rights to be appointed off a list, although the employer could rehire you if they wish to down the road. Local civil service rules for the competitive class typically say employees who are on an approved leave from a position where they have permanent rights have the right to go back to that position. Permanent employees who are on an approved leave of absence while serving in another position on a temporary, a provisional basis, or who are in a probationary status after being promoted, they have a right to go back to their former position. Employees who are on a leave of absence with or without pay for illness because of maternity leave, they have rights in the position that they have a hold on. Who doesn't have rights? Temporary employees with no hold item. Provisional employees who have no hold item. For those of you who don't know what provisional employees are, those are employees who are appointed to competitive class positions at a time when there are no eligible lists to be appointed. So the law allows for employee to be appointed provisionally until the next examination is given. Seasonal employees, per diem employees, hourly employees are non-permanent employees. They do not have any layoff rights. And CSEA's position is, we don't want to see anybody laid off. However, when push comes to shove, competitive class employees with permanent rights and permanent employees in the service of the employer should have the right to remain employed, whereas the non-permanent employees should go before any permanent employee is laid off. It's only right. Layoff units, mentioned this before. The layoff unit that covers your position, whether it's the county or the city civil service rules, or for those two towns, those are the rules that apply to you. They define what a layoff unit is. And typically the boilerplate language is each department of a county, city, town, village, each school district, each community college, each special district, like an authority, and each authority shall be deemed to be a layoff unit. Now, all towns and villages come under the umbrella of the County Civil Service Administration. School districts also, if you're a non-city school district, you come under the umbrella of the County Civil Service rules and regulations. Community colleges, the same thing. County. If you're a city school district and your city has a civil service administration, you come under those rules and regulations. If you're a city school district and your city does not have a civil service administration, you come under the next level, which is the county. Hopefully that's clear. Seniority for layoffs. Competitive class. Section 80 defines seniority as a date of original appointment on a permanent basis in the classified service and all continuous service since that date. Notice it says date of original appointment on a permanent basis in the classified service. It doesn't say date of original appointment to the title. It doesn't say date of original appointment to with the department. It says date of original appointment on a permanent basis in the classified service, which includes competitive, non-competitive labor, or exempt. The date you were first permanently appointed sets your date of seniority for layoff purposes. On the date of layoff, that where you are on that date is the important piece of information, because if you served 20 years as a laborer and then 5 years as a competitive class custodian, you have 25 years of seniority for layoff purposes. Okay, non-competitive and labor class, unfortunately, you have to look to your contract. Or maybe it is fortunate because some contracts provide a pretty interesting layoff language that may even be better than what the law provides. So check your contract if you're non-competitive or labor class. And that includes, non-competitive class includes teacher aides, and teaching assistants, again, are in the teaching assistants are in the unclassified service and come under the education law. But teacher aides are non-competitive. Now, your seniority, once it's determined, can be adjusted if you're a veteran. Section 85 of the Civil Service Law provides disabled veterans 60 months or 5 years of extra service credit added to their date of original appointment. So if you have 25 years of seniority, classified seniority, and you're a disabled veteran, and disabled veteran is You have to be at least 10% disabled as determined by the Veterans Administration. And it's got to be a permanent disability. You get 5 years of service credit. So you have 25 years of regular service credit plus 5 years of veterans credit. Now you have 30 years of seniority for layoff purposes. Spouses of a 100% disabled veteran, they also get 5 years. Now, if you're a non-disabled veteran and you are a veteran as defined by the serving in periods of war or periods of conflict, as I will explain in a few minutes, you get an extra 2.5 years. Veterans and exempt volunteer firefighters, when an employer is going through a layoff where there's not a massive amount of positions being abolished, those individuals, veterans and exempt volunteer firefighters under Section 86 of the Civil Service Law, they must be transferred to titles that are appropriate, if at all possible, before being laid off. Sometimes it can't be helped. If there's massive layoffs, there's no place to transfer to. If you're a veteran, you must be a veteran during these time periods. And if you were a veteran of the Lebanon, Grenada, or Panama campaigns, you must have an expeditionary medal from the Armed Forces, Navy, or Marine Corps. Disabled veterans must have served during a time of war, as indicated in the last slide. You must be certified that the U.S. Veterans Administration is eligible for a disability of at least 10%. Disability status has to be established on or before the date of layoff. Please, my advice to everyone is to go to their personnel file, whether you're a veteran or not. Make sure all of your information is current and accurate. If you've moved recently, had a name change, or if you're a veteran and you haven't identified that fact to your employer or civil service, you must have that on your personnel record prior to the date of layoff. Otherwise, your seniority will not be adjusted. What does seniority include? We mentioned before it's a date of original appointment on a permanent basis. However, seniority does, what happens if you have an approved leave of absence with or without pay during your career? As long as you're permanent on the date of layoff, that approved leave counts toward your seniority. If you are during your career appointed on a temporary or provisional basis between two permanent appointments, that time counts. What doesn't count is temporary or provisional appointment before your first permanent appointment. That time does not count for seniority for layoffs. It could very well count for retirement service, but not for service for layoffs. Time while on workers' compensation and termination followed by reinstatement. If you're on workers' comp and you're on workers' comp for a year and you're terminated, and then you come back to work, then all that time counts toward your seniority. It goes all the way back to the date of original appointment on a permanent basis. Time on a preferred list. If you are unfortunately laid off, and you're laid off for 2 years, and then you are rehired, that 2-year period counts toward your seniority. For non-competitive in labor class, again, you must look at your contract. Now, seniority does have some negative effects, and it's negatively affected by, if you're on a preferred list and the preferred list, you're not hired back within 4 years, which is the statutory life of the preferred list, then unfortunately you started out as a brand new employee if you're ever rehired. Temporary or provisional service before the first permanent appointment, I mentioned that before, that does not count. If you have a break in service of more than 1 year in local government, unless your rule says something different, a break in service of more than a year, say you resign and you come back 14 months later. If it's over a year, then you get a new seniority date. If you resign and are rehired within the year, then your date goes back to the original seniority date. Okay, I hope that the definitions are clear, and I will talk a little bit more about them as we talk about the layoff process. Now, if you'd like to stop here and then come back for the layoff process, that's perfectly fine. But if you want to continue, I welcome you to continue and walk through this with me. Now, we talked about a lot of terminology. We talked about layoff units. We talked about classified service titles, appointment types. Now we're going to get a chance to use all that new knowledge as we go through the layoff process. Bumping and retreating. Those are the common terms that you hear when we're talking about layoffs. However, those are the in-house terms. There are some official civil service terms that we must use when we're talking about layoff process. In the competitive class, there's something called a horizontal reassignment. Horizontal reassignment, a lot of people call it a bump. That happens when you have a number of positions in the same exact title, and the employer decides that they're going to abolish a few of those positions. Now, those positions, depending on the work location, may actually be encumbered or be filled by people who have the most seniority of the whole layoff unit. Horizontal reassignment allows them to bump or displace or reassign into a position in that same layoff unit that is held by a person who has less seniority or less retention standing. We'll talk about an example here, but it's got to be exact title to exact title. Remember the parenthesis, remember the parenthetic titles. Typist is different than a typist parenthesis Spanish speaking. A typist cannot bump a typist Spanish speaking, and vice versa. Each title stands alone during the layoff process. Once it's determined that the least senior person in a particular title is to be laid off or excessed, I hate that term, but excessed, then if they have service in a lower level title prior to their current position, or even if they didn't, sometimes people promote via a very general promotion list. And if you have served in a lower level title or you promoted to a higher level title, the promotion, you have the right, if you're the least senior at that higher level, to vertically displace down in direct line of promotion. Again, direct line of promotion is the same generic root title: clerk, senior clerk, principal clerk. If you're a principal clerk, you can bump down to a senior clerk if there is a position that is occupied by a person who has less seniority. Get this question, will my salary be affected? And the answer is yes. The employer will recalculate your salary if you bump down into next lower level title, which is typically in a lower salary grade or salary level. That is called a vertical displacement. A lot of people call that, again, a bump down to the next lower level occupied title in direct line of promotion. And then the third alternative or third option is retreat, where if there are no titles in direct line of promotion downwards, no filled titles, you can retreat back to the title that you held last on a permanent basis. We'll go through several examples of each. The layoff process. Occupants' rights are determined. If you are permanent in the competitive class and you're off probation, you have the most rights of anyone in that title, depending on the number of years of your total seniority. Permanent employees who are on probation, they have less retention standing. If they are on a hold on a lower level position, then they normally, if they're displaced, they can go back to their hold item. If they have a hold item, you have to check the rules because some local employers do not offer hold items for people who are on probation when they've promoted. Contingent permanent employees sometimes, depending on the rules, have rights. Now, contingent permanent employees, some rules don't give them any rights. Some local government rules say that contingent permanent employees will be treated the same as permanent employees for layoff process. And if you're on probation, you have less rights than people who are not on probation. Non-permanent employees, including provisional and temporary, have no layoff rights in the title that they are holding. Hopefully, there's a hold item they can go back to. Refer to your local civil service rules for rights of contingent permanent employees, as well as the layoff process. Okay, now we're ready to rock and roll. We're going to look at the layoff process, and we're going to start at the top level, the horizontal reassignment. Now, the horizontal reassignment is title to exact title in the same layoff unit. We're assuming here that both typists in this example are permanently hired, permanently appointed. One typist has 20 years of seniority in this example. The other typist has 10 years of seniority. They both work in the Department of Health for the county. Does the employee, suppose the employee who has 20 years of seniority, suppose that position is abolished. Does that individual have the right to displace into or bump out the 10-year seniority employee? The answer is yes. Because the typist whose position was abolished has greater retention standing, greater seniority than the typist with 10 years of seniority. The typist with 20 years can displace the person with 10 years of seniority. And if that typist with 10 years of seniority has a hold, they can bump down into a hold. Typically, typists are entry level. So there's no lower level line so that they can bump down into. So that 10-year typist is probably going to be laid off. And if they're permanent, they'll have a right to have their name placed on a preferred list. If the typist that we're talking about was with 10 years of seniority was on a leave of absence from another title, they would be able to go to that level title. Okay, here's an example. And I want to let you know here that employers get to choose what positions they're going to abolish. They don't just choose the least senior position, the positions that are encumbered with the least senior employees. That would be easy. But because employers have multiple work locations, they have different units within departments, as long as it's within the same layoff unit, they can choose any position to abolish. The employee in that position then is going to be compared with all other employees in the same title for displacement purposes. Here's an example. We have 3 typists, one with 20 years, one with 10 years, one with 5 years of seniority. They all work for the same Department of Health, County Department of Health. We have an office on the east side, we have an office in the north, and we have an office that's considered to be the main office. Now, the employer is they've decided to close the east side office or just simply abolish the typist position at the east side office. Does that 20-year employee have the right to displace the 10-year employee or the 5-year employee? Now, typically what the civil service law says is that the person with the greatest seniority displaces the employee with the least seniority in that title. But many employers will allow an employee to, by rule, displace a person who has not the least seniority, but less seniority. So that 20-year employee would have the right to displace the employee in the north office. Now, I'm not trying to intimate here that the employee who's being displaced has the right to choose what position. The employer decides which position the more senior employee gets to bump. Okay, so because they're all typists, the 20-year seniority employee has the right to displace, in this example here, the 10-year seniority typist. If, in this same example, the employer decides, no, we're going to have the most senior employee whose position's abolished, which is the one on the east side, they have to displace the employee who has the least seniority. And can that happen? Absolutely. And remember, it's the same layoff unit. If these positions were included in different departments, then the answer would be you cannot bump outside of your layoff unit. You have to bump within your layoff unit. Exact title to exact title. Remember that. It'll come in handy with this example. Example number 2. This is a horizontal reassignment example. We're talking about the same layoff unit, that Department of Health. We have a 20-year employee. We have a 10-year employee. Will the typist with 20 years of seniority, their position is going to be abolished? Will that typist be able to displace the typist with Spanish speaking? If you've been listening, and hopefully you have been, the answer is no. Why? Because a typist Spanish speaking is different than the typist with no parenthetic. Parenthetics mean something. We need to be aware of that. You need to understand and know what your current civil service title is, because during this process, it will become very, very important. Let's take a third look here. We have 2 senior typists. Good so far. We're in the department of, we have 20-year employee and a 10-year employee. The Department of Health is going to abolish a senior typist, and assuming there's no other senior typist in the Department of Health that the senior typist can go to and bump, can that senior typist bump a senior typist in the Department of Social Services because they have less seniority? The answer is no. Why? Because they're 2 separate departments. They're in 2 separate layoff units. All bumping and retreating happen within layoff units, which is defined again as a department. A school district is a single layoff unit. Okay, so we've done our examples. Now, those were very basic examples. Multiply that by tens or even hundreds of positions and multiple titles at various salary levels, and you begin to see how a rather simple concept can get very confusing very quickly. But if you remember the basic elements, the basic definitions, that should help you understand the process. The next level, if you are bumped from a higher level title, you can't bump anyone else in the same exact title because your seniority won't allow you to. The next option is vertical displacement. Vertical displacement, you have to meet certain criteria. The criteria is you must be permanently appointed to a title above the entry level of a promotion line. We talked about what a promotion line is. Remember, we had the typist, senior typist, principal typist. That's a promotional line. If you're a typist, you're different than an account clerk typist. Okay, so titles are very important. Number 2, you must not have the ability to displace any other individual who holds the same title as you in the same layoff unit with less seniority. So if you're the one who's going to be displaced from the higher level title, then if there is a position in a lower salary grade, in direct line of promotion in the same layoff unit, then you can bump down to that position and displace the person who has less seniority and less retention standing. That position must be in a lower grade, and it must be occupied by a person who has less retention standing or less classified seniority. Direct line of promotion. Again, I'll do this one last time, or you can review this as many times as you would like. Clerk is the entry level in a clerk series. The generic route is clerk. The next hierarchical position is senior clerk, and then principal clerk, or clerk 1, clerk 2, clerk 3. But it has to have the same generic root title. Another example is typist, senior typist, principal typist. Okay, time for our examples. This is a vertical displacement title or example. Now, all the principal clerks in the Department of Social Services, this is the 20-year employee is the least senior, cannot displace another principal clerk because they are the least senior. They could have promoted to the principal clerk from a senior typist position by taking a promotional exam. Doesn't matter how you get to the title you hold. What matters is, on the date of layoff, what is your promotional line? Promotional line is clerk, senior clerk, principal clerk. If you're the least senior in the title where you're going to be displaced, if there is a position in direct line of promotion that is occupied by a person who has less seniority than you, you can bump that person. And again, this is Department of Social Services. We're talking about the same layoff unit in all three titles. We have three different work locations, actually two work locations. The the principal clerk with 20 years of seniority, can that person displace the person with 10 years or the person with 5 years of seniority? Can that principal clerk bump all the way down to clerk and displace the clerk because they're in the same office? The answer is no, because the law and the rules say that you have to go to the next lower level occupied position in direct line of promotion. So that principal clerk would have to displace the senior clerk in the Department of Social Services who has less seniority, not the person who has a less seniority in the title series. Okay, you go down, it's like an elevator. You're on the 3rd floor, you go down to the 2nd floor, and you displace the senior clerk. Okay, now, suppose the principal clerk is now the senior clerk. And now the employer says, okay, suppose the principal clerk bumps out another senior clerk with 10 years of seniority. Now we have another senior clerk who has 10 years of seniority, and the employer is going to abolish that senior clerk's position. Can that senior clerk now displace the clerk, assuming that the senior clerk couldn't displace another clerk, senior clerk within that title? And the answer is yes. Okay, so it's the next lower level occupied position in direct line of promotion, as long as that person who's occupying the position has less retention standing. Okay, another example here. Same layoff unit, Department of Mental Health. We have a principal typist with 20 years of seniority. We have a senior typist, Spanish speaking, 10 years of seniority. And then we have a typist with 5 years of seniority. Now, can the principal typist displace a Spanish speaking senior typist with 10 years of seniority? Well, it's the next lower level occupied position, but it's not the same title series. Senior clerk Spanish speaking is different than the senior clerk. So the answer is no. Now, the principal clerk with 20 years of seniority would have to displace the typist with 5 years of seniority. So the principal typist goes all the way down to the floor. Express elevator down to the 1st floor. And the answer should be yes. So the answer should be yes on this one, because it's the next lower level occupied position in direct line of promotion. Seeing that there's no senior typist in the Department of Mental Health, then the principal typist should displace the 5-year seniority typist. Now, can an employee refuse to bump a person in a lower level title? The answer is yes. What happens? If a principal typist decides that they don't want to bump into a typist position, then the principal typist will be laid off. Their name will be placed on a preferred hiring list for 4 years for the principal title, but will not be able to displace anywhere else. Okay? Vertical displacement, example number 3. We have a principal keyboard specialist in the XYZ Central School District's main office with 20 years of seniority. There are no senior keyboard specialists in the school district. We have a keyboard specialist down in the middle school with 5 years of seniority. Can the principal keyboard specialist displace down to a keyboard specialist with 5 years? And the answer is yes. Okay. You cannot bump into a vacant item. Even if they had a senior keyboard specialist vacancy in the superintendent's office, the main office, a principal level cannot bump into a senior level unless that senior level position was occupied by a person with less seniority. So that principal level would be offered the ability to bump down to a keyboard specialist position. Now remember, whenever you bump down to a lower level title, your name is placed on a preferred list for the title you were laid off from and any titles in the middle. Okay, so that we've covered horizontal displacement, title for title, vertical displacement, going down in direct line of promotion. Now we're going to talk about the last option. It's called retreat. Retreat occurs when and only when there are no lower level occupied positions in direct line of promotion at any level to bump into. We have some criteria. Again, you must be permanently appointed to the title that is affected by the layoff. You must not have the ability to displace anyone else either horizontally, same title, you're the least senior person in that title, in that layoff unit, or vertical displacement. There are no occupied lower level positions in direct line of promotion in your title. Now, you have the right, if you're in that situation, you will have the right to displace into a title that you had previously held immediately before the current title. Now, this option is only used very rarely, but I'll explain it anyway. The employee who is doing the bumping must have served in a lower graded position that is not in direct line of promotion. Okay, and on the date of layoff, the title they had served in previously has to be in the same layoff unit. Remember, we cannot bump under any circumstances. We cannot bump outside of the layoff unit. So we'll give you an example. Must have been the last permanent appointment before the current position. And the lower graded position must be occupied by a person who has less retention standing. Now, we all know when we take promotion exams, some promotion exams are only open to employees who are in direct line of promotion. Sometimes employers will expand that and will allow other employees in other titles, another title series, to compete in the promotion exam. So if you're a senior clerk and you're allowed to take a promotional exam to principal typist, and that's how you got to the principal typist position via promotion exam, then when you get appointed as a principal typist and you're the least senior and there's a layoff, and say there's no senior typist or typist position to bump down into, then you can bump back to your senior clerk title, even though it's outside of the direct line of promotion. But that senior clerk title has to be in the same layoff unit, which is the department. Here's an example. We have principal account clerk, 20 years of seniority. We don't have any senior account clerks or account clerks. And we're all in the same county office, okay? The county clerk's office. Now, I'm an employee, I'm a senior typist. I have 15 years of seniority with the county clerk's office. I take a promotional exam, and I'm appointed to the principal account clerk. on a permanent basis. Now, 5 years later, I have 20 years of seniority. There are no lower level positions in direct line of promotion. And at the time of layoff, they're going to abolish the principal account clerk position. I don't have another principal account clerk to bump horizontally. I can't bump down to the senior account clerk or the account clerk because there's no occupied positions. So, suppose at this time, there's a senior typist who now has 15 years of seniority, working in the same layoff unit. It's the last position held before promoting to the principal clerk. Can I bump that senior clerk with 15 years of seniority in the county clerk's office? Drum roll. The answer is yes. That is a retreat. You retreat back to the position you last held before promoting or before you became a principal account clerk in this example. You can bump the person who has less seniority as long as the position's in a lower salary grade and is occupied with a person with less seniority. Let's look at another retreat example. We have a principal account clerk, senior account clerk, and account clerk. Now we're in the city parks department. Same scenario. I was a senior typist in the city parks department many years ago, and I took a promotion exam. Now I'm a principal clerk, the only principal clerk. And the parks department says, sorry, Don, we're going to have to abolish your position. Well, I can't bump another principal account clerk because there aren't any. But I remember Don Kelly told me that now I can bump down to the senior account clerk. The only time you can do that is if you have greater seniority than the senior account clerk. Very important. Remember, the senior account clerk in this example has 25 years of seniority. I only have 20. I cannot bump the senior account clerk. So my ride ends right there. That effectively, can I retreat back to a senior typist because I can't bump down in my title series? The answer is no. I can't retreat. Why? Because remember what the criteria says. There's got to be no lower level titles in direct line of promotion that you can bump into. However, I can't bump the senior account clerk because the senior account clerk has greater seniority, years of service on a permanent basis than I do. That effectively blocks my ability to retreat. It's a little confusing. Let's look at another example. Now I'm a senior typist with 10 years of seniority in the city parks department. There are no positions in the typist position in the city parks department. I'm the least senior typist. Well, okay. Now, I can't bump into a vacancy, so I can't bump, or if there's no positions, the city doesn't have to create one for me. So the only game in town would be a retreat. Now, I used to be a clerk before I became a senior typist. Took the senior typist promotion exam and did well, was appointed. I'm permanent. I have 10 years of seniority. I used to be a clerk immediately before I was a senior typist. But look here, the clerk, I was a senior clerk at City Hall, separate department. Can I displace into the clerk position? I can't bump down. I can't, there's no one I can bump in my same title. I can't bump down. The only option I have would be a retreat. Unfortunately, we're talking about two separate layoff units. You can serve in a position in a different department and promote into your current department. What matters is where are you on the date of layoff? What layoff unit? What title? If that clerk position, if the Parks Department had a clerk position with a person with 5 years of seniority, then I certainly can bump that individual. But under this example, I can't, because you cannot bump, retreat, or anything outside of your layoff unit. The answer is no. So I've gone through the horizontal reassignment, vertical displacement, and the retreat. I know these are difficult concepts to think of. However, we do have booklets, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about at the end. But now, suppose you are serving either in a lower level title, in direct line of promotion, or you retreated back to your other title. You have certain rights to the title and the position that you were abolished, or that you were laid off from. You could be actually unemployed with and receiving your unemployment check. You do have certain rights if you were a permanent employee on the date of layoff. Let's talk about reemployment. Reemployment, there are several methods of reemployment within public sector service. Competitive class employees have preferred list rights under Section 81 of the Civil Service Law, and your rules and regulations may have preferred list rights as well. Promotion eligible lists preferred list rights are greater than promotion eligible lists when you take a promotion exam. So when after a layoff, the employer is going to fill a position in a title where you used to serve on a permanent basis and one in which you were laid off from, you have greater rights. They have to appoint you before they go to a promotion eligible list. They have to appoint you before they can appoint anyone from an open competitive list. They have to take you before they reinstate anyone who might have resigned or went out on workers' compensation and was terminated, and then they want to come back. You have rights to that vacancy before anyone who can be transferred. As a preferred list rights eligible employee, you have rights to go back to your former position. Preferred list is a mandatory list established on the date of layoff containing the names of laid off employees ranked by layoff unit and seniority for reinstatement to their layoff title in direct line or lower level titles. So if you're laid off, say as a principal typist, your name is on a preferred list. And if there are more principal typists who are laid off, their names are also on that list. That list is ranked according to your seniority, your classified seniority, date of original appointment on a permanent basis with the employer. When they go to fill a principal level position in that title, they have to go to the preferred list. They have to go, it's a rule of one, they have to go to the first person on that list and ask them whether they wish to accept the appointment. In competitive class, it's covered under Section 81, the preferred list. Names remain on a preferred list for up to 4 years. Names are arranged in the order of seniority, most senior to least senior. Preferred list rights for non-competitive and labor class rights have to be negotiated. So like the layoff process, preferred list rights are or should be included in your collective bargaining agreement or your contract. If there's no language on recall for non-competitive and labor class, then that means that the employer is not obligated to rehire you at all. Now, some preferred list language in the contract will last for 4 years, similar to the competitive class. Or I've seen language that say preferred list rights only last for a year or 2 years. So every contract is different. You need to get a copy of your contract and see what it says about rehiring after being laid off. Here's the preferred list certifications, the way an employer is required to fill positions after a layoff. Hopefully, after a layoff and the employer gets additional funding, they'll reestablish some of these positions and they'll hire people back. If there's a vacancy in the Department of Layoff, in the Layoff Unit, they have to go first to the eligible list for that title for those who are laid off in that Layoff Unit. Once that list is depleted, once they have no more individuals on the preferred list for that Layoff Unit, then they can go to a general list for the employer, all departments within the employer. I'll give you an example. You're laid off the Department of Health, and after the layoffs, the employer wants to fill a position in the Department of Health. They'll go to the Department of Health preferred list first, and if my name is there, I get the appointment. But suppose over in the Department of Parks, they didn't lay off anyone, or they laid off people and they hired as many back as they could hire. But now they have a vacancy. There's been a retirement. So I've been laid off in the Department of Health. Now, when the Department of Parks goes to fill that vacancy, they'll ask for a preferred list. When they find that there's no preferred list, then they go to the all departments list. Now, my name is on the all departments list because I was laid off the Department of Health. So my name is on the Department of Health list as well as the general list for all departments. So, and if I'm the first person by my seniority on the list, on the all departments list, I have to be offered that job first in Parks. Okay. Preferred list certifications, the order of certifications, again, from most senior to least senior. Exact title for exact title. Employees who are laid off in that exact title will be offered the job first. Now, if it's a higher level title, then anyone who is laid off in that higher level title will be on a preferred list for that title. Now, if I was laid off in a principal typist position, my name would appear on the principal typist position, the senior typist position, and the typist position or preferred list. They go, if they're going to fill a senior level position, they'll go to the senior level, senior typist level preferred list first until they have no one available. If they have no one available, there's no preferred list, then they'll go to the principal level to see if I would be interested in accepting the position. It's very important if you refuse a reemployment to your old title because, say, it's downtown instead of uptown, your name can be removed from that eligible list, and you would not be entitled for reemployment any longer. Members must know the following here. Again, know your civil service title. jurisdictional class that governs that title. Are you competitive class? Are you non-competitive? Non-competitive labor and exempt class employees, you would look to the contract. Typically, there's no language for exempt class, but non-competitive and labor class employees, if you're laid off, you must go to the contract to see if there's layoff language or reemployment language. What is your appointment type? Are you permanent? Only permanent employees have the right of layoff and recall under civil service law and your local rules and regulations. Your layoff unit. Hopefully you know that a layoff unit is your department. And a school district is a single layoff unit. A community college is a single layoff unit. Your seniority, your classified seniority, is the date of original appointment on a permanent basis and all classified service after that time. On the date of layoff, you have to be permanent in your position in order to have permanent rights to that position. If you're not permanent in the current position and you have a hold on a lower level position, then your rights are that you can bump back into your lower level position. Eligibility for seniority. Are you a veteran? Do you have extra service credit that you're entitled to? Members, you must be sure or make sure that you can be found. Contact your employer and your local civil service office, your personnel office, the New York State Retirement System, with any name changes, address changes, telephone number changes. They need to find you, because if they send out a request for filling a vacancy to an old address and you don't respond, they don't care that your address changed. They send it to the last address that they have on record. And it's up to you to make sure that your name, address, telephone number are accurate, and whether you're a veteran or not. Here's some resources that you may find interesting. Local Civil Service Local Civil Service Office, also known as Personnel Office or Human Resources Office. Those are the offices that you should check to make sure that your identity is correct and your title and appointment status is correct. Local Civil Service Rules, available online or in your local civil service office. The CSEA website, which is found below, contains layoff publications as well as layoff services guide for members who are laid off. Once you get on the website, you have to log in with your membership identification. There's a tab that says Members. Hover your mouse over the Members tab. You'll see a drop-down box. Go down to where it says Resources. Click on Resources. Another box will open up and it'll say Layoff Services or Layoff Information. Click on that and then you'll be able to access our layoff publications, a copy of this presentation, as well as a layoff services guide. And if you want to go through a interactive learning tool, there's even that. We put together a learning tool so you can walk through it, learn the definitions, and see how the process works. CSEA Work Institute has put together a wonderful publication known as the Layoff Services Guide. It goes beyond the process of layoff and recall. It talks about what you must do once you're laid off and unemployed regarding insurances and applying for unemployment insurance and looking for other jobs. When you are laid off and your name's on a preferred list, you do have access. You can access learning information, learning publications regarding how to take an examination. You must sign up for a 1-year dues-free membership if you are totally unemployed. We offer a 1-year dues-free membership, except for the CSEA officers. They have to pay their dues directly in order to keep their membership active. The CSEA contract, that has a lot of valuable information. The online learning tool, as I described before, you go to the members tab, then resources, then layoff information. So I wish to thank you for hanging in there, and if you should have any additional questions, you can send them to the CSEA Research Department at research@cseinc.org. I wish you well. I hope that you don't have to use anything that's included in this presentation, but if you do, I hope that you use it wisely and that you understand the terminology that has been used today. So with that, I will say goodbye and best wishes.